Let's start. Ladies. Woo! Woo! Energy. Ladies.
Gentlemen,
Developers.
developer.
We want to welcome you to our talk, React.
WAT.
So I'm Ariel. I'm a full-stack developer at Next. I am a public speaker in meetups, in conferences. I'm really enthusiastic about dogs. This is my dog, Ginger. She's a backend developer. And this is my other... What? Who said that?
Who said that? I'm Yoav, like I mentioned. I've been a web developer for the past 15, almost 20 years. I'm a public speaker, meetups, conferences. I'm a father of two. That's why I got these black socks on my eyes. And because Ariel put an image of her dog, I had to put an image of my cat. He's over there. Other than that, I work at a company called Jux. I'm a senior developer there, but I'm also a partner at ReactiveDev, like I mentioned. So again, for any of your React needs, talk to us. And without further ado, let's talk about this talk. All right. This talk kind of stands on the shoulder of giants. Like the whole idea came about from an original talk titled WAT by Gary Bernhardt. Now, Gary Bernhardt is an excellent developer, a great content creator, a public speaker, a conference speaker. And he tried to show, he did a lightning talk back in 2012 about like the quirks of different programming languages. It was mostly based on Ruby, but he did touch on other kind of programming. Now, the whole idea was to explain quirks of programming languages using WAT images. If you're not familiar with WAT images, we'll get to that in just a second. Now, besides Gary Bernhardt, also Brian LaRue gave a talk back in 2012 titled What the Fuck JS, where he kind of also discussed all the very funny quirks in JavaScript. But the real inspiration came from a good friend of mine, a good friend of ours, Shai Resnick, who gave a talk titled NGWAT 9 years ago. And now I alluded to what a WAT picture is. So if you look on the right-hand side, that is kind of idea. It's a picture that is supposed to kind of give you a sentiment of what the quirk of the programming language is. It'll just make you feel like that. And that is the main idea. WAT. Now this is the original meme, the original WAT meme. So if you don't get like what the idea of a WAT image is, here's another one. This is somebody trying to fill his Redux Funk store. Okay, anyway. But what's in it for me, Ariel?
So first, the idea of a WAT image is to give you this feeling when you see something weird in a programming language and you're like, what? That's the idea behind this. And like this is our WAT sword. I forgot we had a WAT sword. This is the WAT sword. So what's in it for you? Why do you need a React WAT talk? The thing about React is that, quite unfortunately, it's quite easy to hold it wrong. React requires you to have quite a deep knowledge, both in JavaScript and also in React itself, in order to write good performance code. So like it has this appearance of the DX is like simple, and it's all just one function that renders it all. But behind the scenes, you actually need to be aware of a lot of trade-offs that you're making when you're writing React code. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start off easy, and then it's going to go deeper. But so if you're a senior developer and the first quirks seem trivial to you, wait. If you're a junior developer, listen very, very closely from the beginning, because these are things that I wish somebody would have told me when I was a junior.
So
without further ado, let's go. And we're going to start easy. Okay, the lightest quirk, the most basic one maybe, is that React, as a matter of fact, is not reactive.
What?
We have this simple React snippet. Okay, we have this to-do state that's initialized to be 0. We have this use effect we call set to do with 3, and then we console log to do. What would this console log be? You wanted to say 3, I know it. So yeah, it's 0. Now, React developers, React lovers, all of us like to say that this is a bug, but this is actually a feature or a design decision, because the idea is that when we call set to do to 3, we're actually not really updating to do. What we are doing is telling React that we want to update to do to 3. And this allows React a lot of very cool things, okay? This allows React to do auto batching. So let's say that in this use effect, for example, we would have called set to do 5 times. Because we're not really updating to do the moment that we call the function, and React would only perform updates after the use effect, this allows React to ignore redundant state updates and to stay performant. So React is not reactive. It is actually asynchronous. Asynchronous. Thank you. So that was just a warm-up. Now we're really gonna start. And we're gonna start with a quite simple but quite tricky part of React. So dependency arrays, we see them everywhere. Use effect, use callback, use layout effect, use memo. My personal favorite hook, use imperative handle, that I haven't heard about since 2 days ago. And as a matter of fact, most of React's hooks mechanism is based on this dependency array mechanism. And the thing about it is that there's this really quirky thing that you really need to know about how React works to understand the trade-offs that you're doing. So let's take this example, a simple example. We have an array state, okay? It's an array of numbers. And then we have a use effect. And this use effect that console logs re-render is depending on array, okay? This is the only element in the dependencies array. If I have another use effect, okay, let's say I have this use effect where I call set array and I use the function syntax for this, and I get previous array in the arguments of this function, and I do previous dot push 1. Would this trigger the next use effect? Who thinks it would trigger the next use effect? Thank you for doing that. It won't run. It won't trigger the next use effect. But if you would use a different syntax, if you would use the spread operator instead, this would fire the next use effect. This would trigger the next use effect.
What?
Because it is weird, because it kind of seems like we did the same thing. But to understand why this is a problem, we need to understand what really happens in the internal of React. So what React does under the hook is that it takes the dependency array from the previous render, compares it to the dependency array from the current render, and it checks if any of the objects, if any of the element is not strict equal. And what is it about strict equal? Is that we're not only comparing values, we're also comparing references. And we're going to say references, I think, like 1 million times throughout the next 20 minutes. So when we use array.push method, the thing is that we're not changing the reference of array. Push doesn't change the reference. However, when we called the spread operator, we created a new reference, okay? We copied the array to a new reference. And that is the reason why the second time the effect did run, because it depends on the reference of array, not only the length or the value of it.
Isn't the first idea illegal? Wouldn't you get an error for that?
No.
The first functional update.
This one?
Yeah.
No.
Really question.
Why? Why do you think you would?
Because you are mutating and it's not.
Oh, thank you for asking it. It's an interesting topic. Within this function, if you use the function syntax of setting state, within this function, your state is actually mutable. So within this function, it is within this function. Thank you for that. You made it more interesting. Take the WAT sword and the WAT clicker.
All right, let's talk about synthetic events. I'm guessing whoever used React knows that React kind of has these things called synthetic events, which synthetic events are a way for React to kind of listen to events, right? This is the way you kind of put on functions using event handlers, right? So the way you do it is like this little handle click function, right? We just create a function and then we attach it on the on-click on our JS system, right? But let's say we want a native event. What would we have to do? We'd have also to define a function, right? We can go and define a handle native click event that receives the events as an argument. And we'll do something with just console log. But if we want to attach native event React, what we have to do? We have to do it on a use effect. We need to find the element that we're looking for. We need to attach the event listener with add event listener. Also, you probably want to clean up your use effect function by removing the event listener, but I didn't put it here just so it can be a little shorter. Okay. Now that we have both events, which function you think is going to run first? Do you think handle native click is going to run first? Who thinks handle native click is going to run first? Who thinks handle click is going to run first? Ooh, okay. So now it's time to check it out. Let's see if this works. The internet is working. So what we have here is the same code. The only thing is I kind of changed the console log to be alert, because alert is a synchronous event, which will pause browser execution, so we can see. And as soon, drum roll please for me again. Which one is it?
Native event.
Native event fired first.
God.
Synthetic event.
Synthetic event.
All right. What? I love doing just talk just to see it again. Laugh every time that we have a what image and I say whack. Just for that, it's worth it.
It doesn't get
And
old.
even- All right. So why did that happen? It's because React listens to events on them. It wraps whatever platform it's on, and it needs to listen. An event must fire for React to actually handle it. Right? You can't handle an event that you're not listening to. Right? Makes sense. So what?
Okay, so we're gonna discuss children, not Yoav's children, children of actually not the, you have children of the good kind. This is children of the bad kind. On a personal note, I think children is probably one of the worst name choices that React has made, and saying that is saying a lot. Okay, so what is the problem with children? Why do I say that it's a bad naming choice? We have this parent component, okay, it renders a child component, and then we have this child component, really, really easy. When parent re-renders, the child would re-render, easy. Let's say that instead, parent would accept children. And we would have this grandparent component that renders parent and renders child as parent's children. So if grandparent re-renders, parent and child render. Easy. But if parent re-renders, child doesn't.
What?
Why is that? The reason for that is that children is nothing but syntactic sugar for a prop. Okay? It's exactly the same as doing this following thing. And as a matter of fact, children is nothing but a convention. Okay, it could have been named potatoes. It really doesn't matter. The thing is that children is just really bad naming for render props. Okay, you could have passed in a prop with under any name, and it would have the same effect.
Don't say it. But
It's a saved word.
Let's talk about how React demo is too easy to run. All right, so in React, if you have like a really expensive component, like it has lots of API calls, does some computation or whatever, you don't want it re-rendering once it is in a parent that re-rendered, right? If the parent re-renders, you don't want the child to re-render because it's too expensive to run. It's gonna like get your app stuck, okay? So there is a mechanism to handle something like this. React memo. So all you need to do, right, if you have some sort of expensive component that that's the promise, right? You wrap it with React.memo. And then you can use it within like a parent component that might have some state that changes, and then it won't trigger a re-render to it. But this case works because there are no prompts. And when there's no prompts, you got no problem, right? But let's say, you know, a junior developer that was tasked to change the color, the text, and he goes around and puts something like this. Just puts a style tag, right? Another prop style with the color blue. You have broken your memorization.
What?
Thank you.
It's not as good as yours, though. I'm still not there yet.
It
I'm
needs
not
to come from the throat. Yeah. What?
What? What?
So why did it happen? Because the way we wrote it with the object notation, right? This creates a new reference on every render. And this is very, very prevalent in lots of code that I've worked on and code that I've seen and examples and whatnot. Even sometimes we have like default props, or you say, if I have some props, to then put in an empty array. But an empty array will also cause the same issue. Again, because we're creating a new reference. Same thing happens if we use an empty object. Again, a new reference. And then if you do it with children, or sorry, potatoes, this will cause the same thing because we're creating a new reference and this will break memorization. So a way to avoid it is we can use memo, right, to kind of memoize our object, keep the reference. But like the most common thing you can do in React is just lift up your state. Yes,
Yes.
that is a promise.
Yes, but
But-
not always.
Yeah.
Not bulletproof yet. Use client. So when we use React within meta frameworks like Next.js, like the Remix, like App Router, now like just choose because you have more and more meta frameworks by the day. When you use React on the server, we have the use client directive that we actually use when we want to say, this is a component that I need to run on the client. Let's say that we have this client wrapper, okay? And it needs to be clickable. That means it, as Yoav said before, we need to listen to click events on the browser. This is why this component has to be a client component. Now, let's say I have a server component. Okay, I have this server wrapper, and we're on the server, right? So we can do stuff that we do on the server. We can call the file system. So let's say that this is a component that goes to the file system, reads from a file, takes the data from this file, and then renders it within a div. Let's say that the UI requirement for this one is that the client component needs to wrap the read from file component in the UI. If I would attempt to do something like this, like rendering read from file within the client component, I'm going to see an error in my browser console. I'm going to see an error, module not found, can't resolve file system. However, I can fix this. The way for me to fix this is that instead of rendering read from file inside the client component, I would instead use children and have a third server component, a grandparent server component, if you like, that renders client component wrapper and renders read from child as its children. And this does work.
What?
I know. Weird. Why does this work? Why? Let's see, what did we change? So we had the client component was rendering read from child, read from file, and then what we did was to replace read from file with children. But as we said, like children, it could have been named potatoes. It doesn't matter. It's not really about using children as much as this single line. The fact that we removed the import of read from file from the client code, that is what made the difference. Because the truth about use client is that use client is not for React to use. use client is for the bundler. When you use React with a meta framework like Next.js, for example, what really happens under the hood when you call the build step is that the bundler is going to look for all of the files where it can find the use client directive. And the moment the bundler sees that the file has a use client directive, it uses this file as the client boundary. This means that from this client component, all of the nodes down the tree, they are all going to be bundled together to a bundle to be used later on the client. And this is the reason for the error that we saw, because client component imported server component. Server component imported the file system. This import for the file system found its way to our client bundle. And this is why we get this error, module not found, can't resolve file system. So when we accepted children instead, what we actually did is that we separated dependencies. Okay, from that moment on, the client component, when the client component stopped importing the server component, it became independent and it could be bundled all to itself. So it's really important to understand that when we're working with meta frameworks, as much as you're thinking about your componentry, you really need to think a lot about imports that you're making, okay? Because the imports are really what matters. So let's wrap up everything that we talked about. Okay, we started off by talking about how React is not really reactive. It's actually asynchronous, which allows it to do a lot of cool things like auto batching. And it's what's called the pull approach, if somebody knows it. So preferring to wait for state updates instead of firing them synchronously, pushing them synchronously. Next on, we talked about dependency arrays and how when we're using dependency arrays, we actually really need to be focusing on references more than just only the values.
Then we talked about synthetic events and how React wraps the platform it's working on in order to listen to those events so they can actually execute something after an event happened.
And next on, we talked about children and how children are just really potatoes. And really just a bad naming convention for render props.
And we talked about how React memo is really easy to break. Remember, again, it's about references. As soon as you pass in like an object written like with an object notation, that breaks a reference because you're creating a new object. Always try to keep your references stable.
And last but not least, we talked about use client and how use client is not really for the client, for React to use. It's actually a flag used for the bundler. And really, when we're working with meta frameworks, again, you need to be thinking about imports a lot, more than you're thinking that you should. Thank you, everyone. I'm telling you. Love you.
Thank you, everybody. I hope
Thanks.
you had fun in this talk as much as we had fun preparing this and seeing Ariel all the time, like going into WAT.
I'm going to kill him later tonight.
Yeah, later tonight on beers, whoever wants, join us.